Paul McCartney is one of the most celebrated musicians in history. As a member of the Beatles, he helped change the sound of popular music forever. As a solo artist, he's remained at the top of the charts for decades, and as a cultural figure, he's often been cast as the nice Beatle, the charming, polite one who always seemed to get along with everyone. But the truth is far more interesting. Behind the easy smile and diplomatic public persona, McCartney is fiercely competitive. He remembers slights, he has strong opinions about other artists, and he's not always afraid to share them. Over the course of his career, he's found himself in rivalries, disputes, and creative clashes that have shaped his relationships in the music industry. Some were rooted in artistic differences, others in business conflicts, and a few in personal grievances that ran deep for decades. Today, we're counting down 12 artists and bands Paul McCartney reportedly couldn't stand, or at the very least saw as rivals. Some of these relationships started friendly before souring, others were tense from the beginning, and while not every rivalry on this list turned into open hostility, all of them reveal a side of McCartney that's a lot more complex than the image you might have in your head. Number 12, Coldplay. When Coldplay burst onto the scene in the early 2000s, they were hailed as the next great British band. Critics praised their melodic songwriting, emotional ballads, and Chris Martin's distinctive voice. Almost immediately, the comparisons to the Beatles began, not just from fans, but from the media itself. Headlines declared them the Beatles of the 21st century, a title that might sound flattering, unless you happen to be Paul McCartney. On the surface, Paul has been perfectly polite about Coldplay. He's performed alongside Chris Martin at high-profile charity events, spoken warmly about their melodies, and even called Martin a lovely guy. But behind closed doors, some who know McCartney say the endless comparisons have never sat quite right with him. It's not that he dislikes Coldplay personally, it's that he doesn't fully buy into the narrative that they're the rightful heirs to the Beatles' throne. For McCartney, the Beatles' legacy is built on innovation. Every album was a leap into uncharted territory, from the folk rock textures of Rubber Soul to the psychedelic explosion of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Peppers to the stripped-back honesty of Let It Be. The Beatles never stayed in one lane. They created new ones. Coldplay, in Paul's view, hasn't taken those same kinds of risks. While their music is undeniably successful, he reportedly sees it as safe, polished, and often formulaic, crafted to fill stadiums and sell records, but not necessarily to change the landscape of music. And then there's the legacy factor. Every time the press draws a direct line between Coldplay and the Beatles, it invites comparison not just in popularity, but in cultural impact. To Paul, it's not enough to write melodic songs and sell millions of albums. To truly be the next Beatles, you have to reinvent the game. Coldplay, in his eyes, simply hasn't done that. That's where the quiet rivalry comes in. There's no public feud, no cutting remarks in interviews, but there is an unspoken resistance. McCartney's polite praise in public is balanced by a private belief that while Coldplay may be inspired by the Beatles, they are far from matching their groundbreaking spirit. In the end, Paul doesn't need Coldplay to fail, and they don't need his approval to sell out stadiums worldwide. But when you've helped create the most influential band in history and someone else keeps getting called the new you, it's only natural to feel protective of that title. Number 11. Elton John, Paul McCartney, and Elton John have been two of Britain's most beloved musical exports for more than half a century. Both are masters of melody, both have sold out stadiums around the world, and both have built catalogs of songs that will outlive them by generations. On the surface, their relationship has always seemed friendly, full of public praise, shared charity work, and warm moments captured on camera. But beneath that cordial exterior lies a rivalry that's been simmering for decades. Part of it comes down to timing. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, Paul launched his solo career just as Elton John was emerging as a global superstar. For much of the 1970s, their careers ran in parallel, each dominating the charts in their own way. Elton embraced flamboyant showmanship, appearing in glittery outfits and oversized glasses, while banging out anthems on his piano. Paul, in contrast, leaned on his reputation as a songwriting craftsman, focusing on carefully arranged albums and catchy, radio-ready singles with wings and as a solo act. While they respected each other's talent, there were subtle jabs over the years. Elton, known for his sharp tongue, has occasionally joked about Paul being a bit pleased with himself when it comes to his Beatles legacy. Paul, for his part, has reportedly poked fun at Elton's tendency to chase chart trends, adapting his sound to whatever was popular at the time. whether it was disco in the late 70s or glossy pop in the 80s. There's also the unspoken scoreboard factor. In an industry obsessed with numbers, both men have kept a close eye on who's selling the most tickets, topping the most charts, and racking up the most accolades. Elton's farewell tours have broken box office records, while Paul has continued to pack stadiums into his 80s, each proving they can still command an audience on a massive scale. Yet for all the competitiveness, there's a layer of mutual admiration that keeps the rivalry from turning into a feud. Elton has called Paul one of the greatest songwriters of all time, and Paul has praised Elton's ability to connect with audiences in a way few others can. But make no mistake, they're both aware of the other's success, and neither wants to be remembered as the one who came in second. In the end, Paul and Elton's rivalry is the kind that only exists between equals. Two giants who have shared the same stage, the same charts, and the same audience for decades. They may smile for the cameras, but behind the scenes, each is quietly determined to keep outshining the other. Number 10, the Bee Gees. In the late 1970s, few bands were bigger than the Bee Gees. With the release of Saturday Night Fever and its soundtrack, Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb didn't just dominate the charts, they owned them. For a time, they held the record for the most consecutive number one hits, a feat that had previously been the pride of the Beatles. And for Paul McCartney, who had spent most of the 1960s rewriting the rules of popular music, that kind of chart dominance wasn't easy to ignore. It wasn't that Paul disliked the Bee Gees personally. In fact, he admired their harmonies and acknowledged their songwriting skill. But the era of disco created a cultural shift that pushed rock and classic pop to the sidelines. Suddenly, the very musical landscape McCartney had helped build was being overshadowed by a genre that, in his view, didn't have the same depth or staying power. There were also creative differences in how they approached their work. McCartney prided himself on versatility, moving from rock to folk to orchestral pop within a single album. The Bee Gees, during their peak disco years, embraced a sound that was highly stylized, built on falsetto vocals, four-on-the-floor beats, and lush string arrangements. To Paul, it may have felt more like a formula than the kind of constant reinvention the Beatles were known for. And then there was the media. The press loves a passing of the torch story, and as the Bee Gees racked up hit after hit, journalists began positioning them as the new kings of pop. For someone as competitive as McCartney, who still saw himself as an active force in music, those headlines could sting, especially when they compared disco's short-term frenzy to the Beatles' long-term cultural revolution. In later years, Paul softened his stance, performing with Barry Gibb and showing public support for the Bee Gees' legacy. But during the height of disco, there was no question that the Bee Gees' chart dominance and cultural takeover represented a kind of challenge, not just to McCartney's commercial standing, but to the very musical ideals he held dear. It wasn't an open feud, but it was a rivalry rooted in pride, legacy, and the question every artist eventually faces. When the sound of the times changes, do you adapt? Or watch from the sidelines as someone else takes the crown? Number 9, the Monkees. The Monkees were one of the most unusual phenomena of the 1960s music scene, a made-for-TV band assembled to star in a sitcom about a fictional rock group. At first, they didn't even play their own instruments on their records, with producers and session musicians handling the music, while the four members, Davy Jones, Mickey Dolenz, Michael Nesmith, and Peter Tork, acted out comedic plots on screen. To the public, they were a fun, light-hearted act. But to serious musicians of the era, especially those like Paul McCartney who had fought their way up through clubs, tours, and endless hours of rehearsal, the Monkees represented something different. The commercialization of rock. McCartney and the Beatles were at the forefront of the so-called British invasion, which helped turn rock into a global cultural force. Their image and music felt authentic because it was authentic. They wrote their own songs, played their own instruments, and had full creative control. The Monkees, in their early days, were essentially actors miming to music written and performed by others. Paul was too savvy to start a public war over it, but he wasn't blind to the fact that the Monkees' TV fame and catchy singles were often lumped in alongside the Beatles' work by casual listeners. In the mid to late 60s, some U.S. fans even saw them as direct competition. And while the Monkees themselves admitted they were inspired by the Beatles, their show was loosely modeled on the Fab Four's comedic films like A Hard Day's Night. That didn't necessarily make the comparisons easier for McCartney to swallow. To be fair, the Monkees eventually fought for and gained creative control, writing and playing their own music on later albums. By the 1970s, they had earned more respect from peers. But in the heat of the 60s, when Paul and his bandmates were redefining what a rock band could be, The Monkees were a reminder that in the new music industry, image could sometimes matter just as much as musicianship. For McCartney, whose identity was built on being both a writer and a performer, that was a bitter pill. He may not have hated them in a personal sense, but the Monkees were the embodiment of an approach to music making that ran completely counter to his own values. And that was enough to make them a quiet but undeniable rival in his eyes. Number 8, Radiohead. By the late 1990s, Radiohead had become the critics' darling of the rock world. And with albums like OK Computer and Kid A, they weren't just selling records. They were being hailed as visionaries, the kind of band that was changing music, and the way the Beatles had done in the 1960s. The comparisons were flattering to Radiohead, but for Paul McCartney, they created an uncomfortable sense of deja vu. Publicly, Paul has always been diplomatic when asked about Radiohead. He's acknowledged their talent, calling them a good band and praising their creativity. But behind the scenes, it's been rumored that he doesn't fully buy into the idea that they're the greatest band of their generation. And while Paul respects musicians who take risks, he reportedly sees Radiohead's constant reinvention as a little too calculated. A band intentionally chasing the artistic genius label rather than naturally evolving in the way the Beatles did. Part of the quiet rivalry comes down to how the media frames the conversation. For decades, McCartney's name was the gold standard for songwriting excellence. But as Radiohead's critical acclaim piled up, headlines started to crown them as the new torchbearers of innovation in rock. It wasn't about sales. Radiohead has never matched the Beatles' commercial impact. It was about prestige. And prestige is something Paul guards as carefully as any award or chart record. There's also a generational factor. McCartney came from an era where experimentation was balanced with accessibility. And the Beatles could release Tomorrow Never Knows and Eleanor Rigby on the same album, pleasing critics and topping charts. Radiohead, in Paul's view, sometimes lean so far into experimentation that they alienate mainstream audiences. For him, the true mark of musical genius is being able to innovate without losing the masses. The rivalry here isn't personal. Paul isn't trading insults with Tom York, and Radiohead has expressed respect for the Beatles' influence. But it's a symbolic rivalry, one fought in critics' columns and fan debates rather than in interviews or backstage encounters. It's about who gets to wear the crown of most important band, and for someone like Paul McCartney, that's a crown you never stop defending. Number 7, Oasis. In the 1990s, Oasis exploded out of Manchester with swagger, attitude, and a sound that wore its Beatles influence proudly on its sleeve. For Noel and Liam Gallagher, Paul McCartney wasn't just a musical hero, he was practically a deity. They openly praised the Beatles in interviews, covered their songs live, and even styled themselves as the heirs to the Fab Four's throne. But admiration from the Gallaghers has always been a double-edged sword, and it didn't take long for their obsession with the Beatles to turn into something more complicated. At first, McCartney played along with the flattery. He praised Oasis for writing catchy songs and bringing rock and roll back to the forefront of British culture. But as time went on, he began to bristle at the constant Beatles comparisons, and more specifically at Oasis's tendency to lift not just the Beatles' sound, but also their aesthetic, their album covers, and even their poses in promotional photos. Paul, ever the diplomat, rarely took direct shots at Oasis, but he made his feelings known in subtle ways. In the interviews, he would point out that influence was fine, inevitable even, but that great bands ultimately had to find their own identity. The subtext was clear. Oasis might have been good, but they were still playing in the Beatles' shadow. The Gallaghers, of course, weren't ones to take criticism lightly, and Noel has alternated between calling McCartney a legend and poking fun at his post-Beatles work, while Liam once cheekily claimed Oasis were bigger than the Beatles in their prime. These were classic Oasis provocations, part bravado, part publicity stunt, but they didn't go unnoticed. The rivalry here has always been tinged with humor. Paul has been known to joke about Oasis in a way that keeps things light, one not saying they were the best Beatles tribute band out there. But beneath the laughs lies a truth. While McCartney respects their talent, he's never seen Oasis as genuine equals. For him, their greatest strength, their Beatles-inspired sound, is also their greatest limitation. It's a rivalry rooted in admiration, ego, and the challenge of living up to an impossible standard. And while Oasis may have brought Beatlemania-style energy back to the UK in the 90s, McCartney knows better than anyone that there's a world of difference between channeling the Beatles and being the Beatles. Number 6, the Sex Pistols, In the mid-1970s, the music world shifted almost overnight. Out went the elaborate studio productions and polished pop craftsmanship that artists like Paul McCartney had perfected. In came punk, raw, aggressive, and deliberately anti-establishment. Leading the charge in the UK were the Sex Pistols, a band that made it their mission to tear down everything the previous generation of rock stars represented, and few symbols of the old guard were bigger than Paul McCartney. The clash wasn't just musical, it was cultural. McCartney had spent the 1960s and early 70s crafting some of the most meticulously arranged songs in history. The Sex Pistols, on the other hand, prided themselves on three-chord chaos, snarling vocals, and a DIY ethos that mocked the very idea of musical sophistication. Johnny Rotten, John Lydon, the band's frontman, took particular aim at the Beatles, calling them irrelevant and lumping McCartney in with the dinosaurs of rock who were, in his eyes, out of touch. McCartney, being Paul McCartney, didn't descend into a public shouting match. He's too polished for that. But it's clear he didn't see much merit in punk's self-destructive aesthetic or its deliberate rejection of melody and craft. While he later acknowledged that punk had an energy and authenticity that connected with a generation at the time, he likely saw it as an assault on the musical values he held dear. The rivalry was intensified by the media, who loved the contrast. McCartney, the smiling elder statesman of rock, versus the Sex Pistols, the snarling young upstarts. Punk magazines mocked his post-Beatles work as safe and middle-aged, and while mainstream outlets portrayed the Pistols as dangerous and disrespectful, exactly how they wanted to be seen. Over the years, the heat cooled, and even punk veterans have acknowledged the Beatles' influence on rock as a whole. But in the late 70s, the Sex Pistols represented everything McCartney wasn't, and didn't want to be. To him, they weren't revolutionaries, they were wrecking balls swinging at a house he'd helped build. It wasn't a feud that played out in bitter quotes from Paul's side, but make no mistake, there was no love lost. For McCartney, punk was a passing storm. For the Sex Pistols, McCartney was part of the establishment they wanted to burn down. And for a few years, that made them natural enemies in the court of public opinion. Number 5, the Rolling Stones. Few rivalries in rock are as legendary or as long-running as the one between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And while the bands often maintained a public friendship, there's no denying the undercurrent of competition that stretched across decades. For Paul McCartney, that rivalry didn't end with the Beatles' breakup, and it evolved into a personal and professional back and forth with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards that's still talked about today. And in the early 1960s, the Beatles were the clean-cut chart toppers, and the Rolling Stones were marketed as the dangerous, rebellious alternative. The truth was more complicated. Behind the scenes, the two bands were cordial. Lennon and McCartney even gave the Stones one of their first big hits, I Want to Be Your Man, in 1963. But once the Stones found their groove, the comparisons became inevitable. Who was the better band? Who wrote better songs? Who ruled the charts? For McCartney, the rivalry was both flattering and irritating. On one hand, it meant the Beatles had worthy peers. On the other, it meant constantly being measured against a group whose whole brand was built on being not the Beatles. Over the years, the digs went both ways. Paul has occasionally dismissed the Stones as a blues cover band that stuck to their roots, while Keith Richards once called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band rubbish, and referred to Paul's solo work as Muzak. The competition extended into the post-Beatles era. While the Stones continued to tour relentlessly and maintain their image as the world's greatest rock and roll band, Paul was building his solo career with wings, scoring hit singles, but often facing critical skepticism. Each new album or tour from one side seemed to provoke a response from the other. Even in recent years, Paul hasn't been shy about keeping the rivalry alive. In 2020, he reignited headlines by telling The New Yorker that the Beatles' net was wider than the Stones, implying they were more versatile and musically adventurous. Mick Jagger responded with a sly smile, saying, "That's so funny." He's a sweetheart. There's obviously no competition. Of course, both bands have long since cemented their places in music history, and there's genuine mutual respect. But neither side has ever fully dropped the competitive edge. For McCartney, the Rolling Stones were both friends and foils, allies and adversaries. They pushed each other, they took shots at each other, and they gave the world one of the most enduring rivalries in rock history. Number 4, the Who and the Beatles were two of the defining forces of the British invasion, but they approached rock music from very different angles. The Beatles, especially under Paul McCartney's influence, focused on intricate songwriting, lush harmonies, and groundbreaking studio experimentation. The Who, led by Pete Townshend, leaned heavily on raw power, explosive stage energy, and anthems that could shake an arena to its core. On the surface, McCartney and Townshend maintained mutual respect. They've shared stages, praised each other in interviews, and acknowledged the other's place in music history. But beneath that politeness was a quiet rivalry built on differences in style, philosophy, and the inevitable comparisons that came with being two of the UK's biggest bands in the same era. Townshend has never been shy about speaking his mind, and over the years he's made some pointed remarks about the Beatles, and by extension, McCartney. He has at times downplayed their influence on rock's harder edge, suggesting that The Who were pushing boundaries in ways the Beatles never attempted. He also once noted that the Beatles, for all their genius, were a pop band first and foremost, subtly implying that they lacked the grit and power the Who brought to the stage. For McCartney, who has always prided himself on the Beatles' versatility, those kinds of comments likely didn't go unnoticed. While he rarely responds to criticism directly, Paul has made sly references in interviews to the idea that volume and distortion aren't substitutes for great songwriting, a remark that some fans have interpreted as a subtle jab at The Who's more aggressive style. There was also the matter of live performance reputations. The Who built their name on being one of the loudest, most intense live acts in rock history, with Townshend's windmill guitar strums and Keith Moon's chaotic drumming becoming the stuff of legend. The Beatles, by contrast, famously stopped touring in 1966, choosing to focus on studio work. And while Paul has since proven he can still command stadiums well into his 80s, in the 1960s The Who were earning a reputation for stage dominance that the Beatles, by design, no longer pursued. Still, despite the philosophical divide, there's never been open hostility between McCartney and The Who. If anything, their rivalry was a healthy one, each band raising the bar in their own way, forcing the other to think about how to stand out. But the contrast in their approaches ensured that Paul and Pete were always playing different games, even if the scoreboard of public opinion put them in the same league. Number 3. The Beach Boys. Few rivalries in music history were as creatively inspiring and as personally competitive as the one between the Beatles and the Beach Boys in the mid-1960s. And for Paul McCartney, the heart of that rivalry was Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys mastermind who, like Paul, was obsessed with pushing pop music beyond its limits. The seeds of competition were planted in 1965 when the Beatles released Rubber Soul. Its more sophisticated songwriting and cohesive album flow stunned Wilson, who later said it inspired him to create what he hoped would be the greatest rock album ever made. That album became Pet Sounds in 1966, a lush, harmonically rich masterpiece that completely redefined what a pop record could sound like. When McCartney first heard Pet Sounds, he was floored. He called it the single greatest album of all time, and has often cited God Only Knows as his favorite song ever written, but admiration didn't mean the competition stopped. If anything, it intensified. Paul felt the challenge personally, and the result was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album designed to meet and surpass the artistic benchmark Wilson had set. The back and forth between them was like a creative arms race. Each album seemed to push the other further, but while Wilson and McCartney respected each other deeply, there was still a rivalry under the surface. The Beatles were operating at full power as a unit, with Paul steering much of the musical direction by the mid-60s, while Wilson was struggling with band tensions, mental health issues, and the enormous pressure of topping himself after Pet Sounds. In interviews, Paul has been candid about how seriously he took the Beach Boys as competition during that era. He knew their harmonies and arrangements were unmatched, and that Wilson's ambition was every bit as grand as his own. But in his mind, the Beatles' versatility, cultural reach, and willingness to completely reinvent themselves gave them the edge. The rivalry cooled after the Beatles broke up and Wilson's career hit rocky periods, but the mutual influence never went away. When they eventually met and performed together in later years, the warmth between them was genuine. Still, for a few years in the 1960s, Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson were locked in one of the most intense creative rivalries in pop history. And the music world is richer for it. Number 2. Michael Jackson, Paul McCartney, and Michael Jackson started as friends and collaborators. And for a while, it seemed like they were destined to be one of pop's great creative partnerships. In the early 1980s, they recorded 2 hit duets, The Girl Is Mine for Jackson's Thriller album, and Say, Say, Say for McCartney's Pipes of Peace. The songs were successful, the chemistry was good, and Paul seemed to genuinely enjoy working with Michael, who was then skyrocketing into superstardom. But behind the smiles, a storm was brewing, one that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with business. During their time together, Paul had casually mentioned to Michael how lucrative it was to own the publishing rights to songs. As an example, he talked about how he himself had purchased catalogs of other artists' music over the years as an investment. Paul even joked that one day Michael should think about buying some big song catalogs of his own. In 1985, Michael took that advice, but in a way Paul never saw coming. When ATV Music, the company that owned the Beatles' entire song catalog, went up for sale, Jackson swooped in and bought it for $47.5 million, outbidding Paul himself. Overnight, Michael became the owner of the rights to Lennon-McCartney classics like Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Yesterday. For Paul, it felt like a betrayal. He had assumed that if Michael ever had the chance to acquire the Beatles' songs, he would work with him, maybe even split ownership. Instead, his former collaborator had just taken control of his life's work. Publicly, Paul kept his composure, but he didn't hide his disappointment. He admitted in interviews that it put a strain on their friendship, and the two men never recorded together again. Michael, for his part, claimed it was strictly business, nothing personal. He saw the purchase as a smart investment, not an act of malice. But to Paul, it was impossible to separate the business from the personal, especially since it meant he now had to deal with licensing and royalties for songs he had written, with decisions ultimately being made by someone else. The tension between them never fully resolved. Years later, when Sony acquired a stake in ATV, Paul continued to campaign for the return of his publishing rights. While he eventually regained ownership of his share through legal and contractual means, the Jackson deal remained one of the most talked about rifts in his career. It's a rivalry that started in harmony and ended in silence, a reminder that in the music industry, friendship can vanish the moment business gets involved. Number 1, Yoko Ono. Of all the rivalries in Paul McCartney's life, none was as personal, public, or long-lasting as his complicated relationship with Yoko Ono. To many Beatles fans, Yoko has been unfairly cast as the woman who broke up the band, a label that both she and Paul have publicly rejected. But while the truth is far more complex, there's no denying that her presence in the Beatles' final years and her influence on John Lennon created deep tension between her and Paul. The trouble began in the late 1960s when John started bringing Yoko into the studio during Beatles recording sessions. Up to that point, the Beatles had a strict unspoken rule. Wives and girlfriends did not sit in on recording. Yoko's constant presence and her willingness to give creative input disrupted the band's usual dynamic. For Paul, who was already working overtime to hold the group together amid growing disagreements, it felt like one more crack in an already fragile foundation. Musically, Paul and Yoko rarely saw eye to eye. Paul was a perfectionist focused on melody, structure, and accessibility. Yoko, an avant-garde artist, embraced experimental, boundary-pushing work that often clashed with Paul's pop sensibilities. Their creative worlds were miles apart, and that gap widened as John increasingly aligned himself with Yoko's artistic vision. Things got worse after the Beatles split in 1970. Legal battles over the band's business affairs turned ugly, and Yoko often represented John's interest in negotiations. Paul has admitted that during those years, resentment built up, not only because of the breakup, but because he felt shut out of his friendship with John. The closeness they once had was gone, replaced by a guarded, sometimes hostile distance. Over time, the frost began to thaw. After John's death in 1980, Paul and Yoko maintained a cautious but civil relationship. They appeared together at events honoring Lennon, and Paul publicly praised some of her work. But there were still occasional flare-ups, disagreements over how Lennon's legacy was presented, or over decisions about unreleased Beatles material. In the interviews, Paul has been careful, rarely speaking harshly about Yoko in his later years. Still, the tension is visible between the lines. The rivalry between Paul McCartney and Yoko Ono was never just about music. It was about friendship, loyalty, and the pain of watching a partnership that defined your life slowly unravel. Even if both have moved past the bitterness, that chapter of Beatles history remains one of the most emotionally charged, and for Paul, one of the most personal. Paul McCartney's career has been defined by extraordinary success, but also by the rivalries, clashes, and tense relationships that have shaped his journey. From fellow icons like Elton John, the Rolling Stones, and The Who, to creative challengers like the Beach Boys and Radiohead, to the personal storms of Michael Jackson and Yoko Ono, each name on this list tells part of the story of a man who has spent more than 6 decades at the very top of the music world. Some of these rivalries were lighthearted, the kind that fuel creativity and push artists to outdo each other. Others cut much deeper, rooted in personal betrayal, philosophical differences, or the intense pressure of protecting a legacy that's unmatched in modern music. For Paul, competition has never been just about sales or awards. It's about influence, innovation, and how history will remember him. The fascinating thing about McCartney is that he rarely let these rivalries explode into public feuds. He kept most of his sharpest opinions behind the scenes, allowing his music, not his grudges, to define his image. But those who know his story understand that Paul has always been fiercely protective of his place in rock history. Every time another artist is crowned the next Beatles, every time a peer dismisses his work, it lights a spark that keeps him pushing forward. And maybe that's the secret. Rivalries don't just divide, they drive. Without them, we might never have gotten Sgt. Pepper's, Band on the Run, or the countless other moments where McCartney set out to prove once again why he's one of the greatest to ever do it. Now it's your turn. Which of these rivalries do you think had the biggest impact on Paul McCartney's career? And then are there any that you think time has completely healed? Let us know in the comments, and if you love deep dives into music history and legendary artists, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next countdown.